Richard Harris was 82 years old, a quiet old father living alone inside the same family home he had spent 40 years building. The walls still carried memories. Family photos still covered the shelves. His late wife's favorite chair still sat near the window. But lately, the house no longer felt warm. It felt careful, cold, calculated, because his children believed his mind was disappearing. They believed he no longer understood conversations, names, plans, or betrayal. What they did not know was that Richard remembered everything. Every whisper, every fake smile, every greedy conversation they thought he could no longer understand. And every night, after everyone left, Richard wrote it all down inside a small black notebook. Before this story begins, subscribe to the channel because sometimes the deepest pain in life does not come from strangers. It comes from family. After his wife Eleanor passed away, the house became painfully quiet. Richard spent most mornings sitting alone in the kitchen, drinking tea that slowly turned cold. Sometimes he stared at old family photos for nearly an hour. Not because he was confused, but because memories were the only thing that still made the house feel alive. He remembered birthdays, Christmas mornings, the sound of his children laughing while running through the hallway. Back then, this house was filled with love. Now, it felt like people were waiting for something to end. His children started visiting more often. At first, Richard appreciated it, but slowly, he noticed small things. The way they looked at documents, the way conversation stopped when he entered the room, the way they spoke to him slowly, as if he were already disappearing. One afternoon, his oldest son David asked, "Dad, have you thought about simplifying things?" Richard looked at him quietly. "What do you mean?" "The house," David replied carefully. "It's probably too much for you now." Richard nodded slowly, but inside, something felt wrong. That night, he opened the black notebook for the very first time and wrote one sentence. "They think I cannot see what they are doing." A week later, Richard decided to test them. During dinner, he pretended to forget his daughter Emily's name. The room became silent. Emily forced an uncomfortable smile. David lowered his eyes. And suddenly, everyone started treating Richard differently, more careful, more patient, but also less human. Over the next few weeks, Richard leaned deeper into the act. He repeated questions, pretended to forget dates, lost focus during conversations on purpose. Sometimes he stared blankly at walls just to watch their reactions. And every night, he wrote everything down. Every conversation, every expression, every whispered discussion they thought he could not understand. One evening, Richard overheard Emily whisper, "I don't think he remembers anything anymore." David replied quietly, "Then we should start preparing now." Preparing for what? Richard already knew the answer. The house, the inheritance, the money. And suddenly, the man who once felt lonely began feeling invisible. Then came the night that broke his heart completely. Richard was walking slowly down the hallway when he heard voices in the kitchen. He stopped beside the wall. David spoke first. "We should sell the house immediately after everything is finalized." Emily sighed nervously. "Do you think he understands what's happening?" David laughed softly. "He barely remembers breakfast." The room fell silent for a moment. Then another voice quietly added, "We just need to hold everything together a little longer." Richard closed his eyes. The pain hit harder than he expected. Not because of the house, not because of money, but because these were the children he had sacrificed everything for. He remembered working double shifts to pay their school tuition, skipping meals so they could have more, staying awake all night when they were sick, protecting them from pain for decades. And now, they were standing in his kitchen waiting for him to disappear. That night, Richard sat alone beside the table lamp, Rain tapped softly against the windows. His hands trembled slightly as tears rolled down his face. Then slowly, he opened the black notebook again and continued writing. Weeks passed. Richard's act became more convincing. Sometimes even the doctors believed he was fading mentally. But inside the notebook, everything remained precise. Dates, names, exact conversations. Richard documented every betrayal carefully, not because he wanted revenge, but because he was terrified that one day his children would forget who he really was. One afternoon, his youngest daughter Sarah visited alone. Unlike the others, Sarah looked uncomfortable every time inheritance was mentioned. While helping Richard clean the kitchen, she quietly asked, "Dad, are you okay?" For a moment, Richard almost told her the truth, but instead, he simply smiled weakly and nodded. That night, he wrote another sentence inside the notebook. "Sarah still sees me as her father." But even that small comfort could not erase the growing pain inside him, because the people he loved most were slowly turning his final years into a waiting room for death. Then, one evening, Richard invited all three children to dinner. The atmosphere felt tense immediately. Everyone acted polite, careful, artificial. Richard sat quietly at the head of the table, looking weaker than ever. Halfway through dinner, David finally asked, "Dad, have you thought more about the house?" Richard slowly lowered his fork. The room became silent. Then suddenly, something changed. Richard straightened his posture. His shaking hands became still, and for the first time in months, his eyes looked sharp, clear, aware. "I remember everything." Nobody moved. Emily's face turned pale. David stared silently. Sarah looked confused. Then Richard reached into his pocket and placed a small black notebook in the center of the table. Slowly, he opened it. Page after page, he began reading aloud. Every conversation, every plan, every betrayal, every moment, they treated him like a burden instead of a father. Emily started crying quietly. David could not look up, but Richard never raised his voice. His heartbreak spoke louder than anger ever could. Finally, he closed the notebook gently and whispered, "I was never afraid of losing my memory." He looked at each of them carefully. "I was afraid of losing my family." A few months later, Richard's health truly began declining. This time, for real. The notebook became smaller, the writing slower, the house quieter. One morning, Sarah found Richard sitting peacefully beside the same table lamp. A final envelope rested beside him. Inside was a letter, written carefully in Richard's trembling handwriting. "My children, if you are reading this, then my time's over. I do not hate you, but I hope one day you understand how painful it is to feel abandoned before you are gone. A parent does not fear death as much as they fear becoming unwanted. I forgive you, because love should not end inside bitterness. Take care of each other, and remember, one day you will also grow old." Sarah cried before finishing the letter. David sat silently beside the window. For the first time in years, nobody spoke about inheritance, nobody spoke about the house. Only regret remained. Some people grow old fearing they will be forgotten, but the deeper pain is discovering the people you loved most stopped seeing your heart long before your memory faded. Richard Harris did not pretend to test his children. He pretended because he was desperate to know whether love still remained after usefulness disappeared. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. I will never take my parents for granted. And remember this, the greatest tragedy of aging is not wrinkles. It is becoming invisible to the people you once gave everything for.
If this story inspired you, subscribe to Brutal Truth Animated. New cinematic stories every week about discipline, growth, and real change.